Very bad things happened in room 7. That's why room 7 doesn't exist. But when it did exist, room 7 was called the Silkman Suite. It could be found at the very end of a long corridor on the top floor of the Hotel Antelope. Room 7 closed after a series of shocking incidents that occurred in the late 1980s. These incidents occurred prior to the start of my employment at the hotel, which was the oldest hotel in the oldest part of the town it was named after. The colonial-era Hotel Antelope was a historic landmark in an equally historic region. But not all that history was the type found in history books. Signs of this history were all around. The hotel was on Pilgrim Street, adjacent to St. George's Park. Beyond that was Lincoln Avenue, which led to Witch Corner. The historic town of Antelope had gleaming malls built on Native American burial grounds. It had bustling water parks on the site of slave plantations. It was a modern mix of darkness and light, with a rich history recorded in books, or recited cautiously in quiet tones between trusted friends. It was a Monday morning like any other, and I was engaged in a familiar conversation. "I'm sorry, sir. Room 7 just isn't available." I said these same words many times to guests seeking the allure of the supernatural. Before the internet, these guests were rare. The rumours about Room 7 had always existed, but in the analog age, they spread slowly. When the internet arrived, interest in Room 7 went viral. Now we had at least 1 or 2 people daily arriving unannounced, requesting a night in the infamous Silkman Suite. What happened in Room 7 is open to interpretation, but the history of the town was undisputed. When settlers arrived on these shores from England, they were fleeing all kinds of vices, foes and persecution. But the biggest challenge they discovered in their new home was food. The first winter, they faced starvation. The settlers couldn't find enough food to forage, and their slim supply stock soon dwindled, then vanished. At the outset of the first winter, the settler population was 44. By the arrival of spring the following year, there were only 7 left alive. Those remaining all belonged to the same family, named Silkman. The Silkman family, led by their father Stuart, had found an alternative source of nutrition. They fed on their fellow settlers. The wife and matriarch of the Silkman clan was a dark witch from the old world who had outstayed her welcome there. She'd conjured potions and concoctions that aided Stuart and his brothers in the act of killing, skinning, butchering, and consuming their friends and neighbours. They didn't spare anyone, not even pets or children. And that was the recorded history of Silkman Town. The oral history was darker still. There had been wars and disasters, and controversies and celebrations in the 200 years subsequent to the Silkman slaughter of settlers. But that massacre incited infamy. That is how we began. Look, sir, it's not within my power to offer you residence in room 7. It just isn't going to happen. I was fast losing my professional patience with the young couple at the reception desk. They were hipsters dressed in bohemian threads, with $500 ripped jeans and tie-dye hoodies made in Vietnam for 50 cents, and sold on the streets of the city for a small fortune. The couple arrived pointing phones and recording everything. "But please, my man, we came all the way from the city just to stay in the Silkman Suite," the young guy said. I don't think he'd ever been told no in his entire life, and he wasn't taking the rejection well. He started waving his arms, raising his voice and gesticulating. "No, no, no," I repeated, half hoping he would make a bigger scene, so security could unceremoniously eject him from the building. "It's just not going to happen," I added for emphasis. The uptick in people wanting to rent Room 7 always occurred around the anniversary of what staff at the Hotel Antelope had dubbed the intrigue. It was a euphemism for the kind of incident that went unspoken in polite professional settings. But we all had some understanding of what had occurred in the Silkman suite. I'd heard every bit of speculation, encountered every piece of evidence, read every word of testimony. I, more than most, felt obliged to ensure that no one be allowed to stay in that suite. And frankly, I didn't have the authority either way. Only the owner could reopen Room 7, and they weren't dumb or reckless enough to do that. I felt reassured knowing the hotel was in safe hands. That's until it wasn't. The summer season had started early. In the middle of a busy day, I heard the news about the takeover. The Hotel Antelope had been owned by the same local old money industrialist family for the last 5 generations. But those family members that remained were ailing, elderly, or disinterested in continuing ownership of this prestigious, but often loss-making landmark. That's when Hayward Hotels Incorporated intervened and bought the Hotel Antelope outright. The announcement was made after the fact. A meeting was convened and staff were told. "There'll be some changes around here," their representative announced to the assembled audience, somewhat ominously. I don't know exactly why, but even in that moment, my first thoughts were of Room 7. I felt responsible for the fate of the Silkman suite, or, more accurately, those souls who were perhaps destined or desired to end up residing there. So, when the news came, I surprised myself by making only a half-hearted protest. I emailed the new owners using a burner address. I expressed my views about why the Silkman suite should stay closed to my line manager, Greg. But ultimately, I felt such efforts futile and didn't want to push the point for fear of being fired or experiencing other more unseemly reprisals. Greg Martino had been manager at the Hotel Antelope for many years, but his position was now under threat. Corporate wanted to move in a new direction, but Greg believed he could resist the inevitable strategic change by boosting short-term profits. The Hotel Antelope had areas for improvement, like better marketing, seasonal promotions, and membership schemes. But ultimately, Greg understood that to increase income, the hotel had to reopen its prized unused asset. Room 7, the Silkman suite. "What exactly happened here, son?" the mild-mannered and greying priest asked as the door to Room 7 creaked open. Despite my feeble protests, I'd taken the opportunity to mitigate the risk that the Silkman suite posed. So, I brought a priest to offer a blessing to cleanse Room 7 of whatever pain and darkness it held within its gaudily decorated and blood-splattered walls. "Are you sure you want to know, Father?" I replied, the door to the suite still half open. I think I need to know before we step inside," he said, with his voice quivering slightly. I told the priest almost everything, stood there in the corridor, half in and half out of the suite. I kept my voice low and my eyes open, as much to avoid attracting the attention of wandering entities as eavesdropping guests. I kept it clear and concise, avoiding any hint of embellishment in regards to the intrigue. I told the priest of a charismatic local man, a descendant of the first settler family, who formed a death cult committed to harnessing dark magic. They practiced with the resources bought from the proceeds of human trafficking. I told him how the cult started a sanctuary on the edge of town, on the extreme right of Witch Corner. I spoke of how eventually the authorities started investigating and a raid was planned. Then I explained how the charismatic cult leader was tipped off and with 3 of his flock fled the compound and booked themselves into the Silkman suite under assumed aliases. The rest is just speculation, I said to the priest. He seemed surprisingly stoic when furnished with the outline of such a shocking story. I think I need to know, he repeated. Okay, but let's go inside. We entered room 7. The purple curtains were plush and heavy, and only partially closed, so a shard of sunlight split the suite into equal halves of darkness. The floor was part marble, and part covered with a luxurious cream Persian rug in the centre of the room, next to a contemporary black leather and steel sofa. Everything was draped in dust, and there was unidentifiable detritus littered among ornate furnishings and gilded fixtures. The theme of the Silkman suite was obviously eclectic, with still ticking Art Deco clocks above intricately carved, handcrafted, elegant oak chairs. Paintings and photographs from Victorian England adorned the walls. It was those pictures that immediately commanded the attention. They were haunting monochrome portraits of persons unknown, with unblinking eyes firmly fixed front and centre, staring into the very soul of whomever happened to enter room 7. The priest and I carefully observed our surroundings. I had the feeling of being watched. We weren't alone. In fact, this empty room felt full and busy. Dark energy abounded everywhere. Suddenly, the priest jumped backwards, flinching as if touched or interfered with in some way. Turned around, flung his hands in the air, shrieked like a startled chicken, and ran away. "Father, wait!" I shouted after him as he fled down the corridor. For reasons that I still don't understand, instead of following the father, I simply closed the door. I was alone in room 7, frozen by unfamiliar feelings of vulnerability and fear. There was a perfect silence inside the Silkman suite, and a few tense minutes passed. Then, slowly, I realized that the silence was broken by the sound of something breathing. They were short and shallow, with long, empty gaps in between, like they were someone's dying breath. Suddenly, my sight shot to the corner of the room, beneath the portrait of a dark prince. I could see a strange mist emerging from the marble floor. The mist had a swirling centre, and a shape inside began to form. It looked vaguely human, with long, gangly arms. A torso was taking shape, then a face. The smell of vomit and death lingered in the air and danced on my tongue. The face in the mist had black holes for eyes. Its skin was like torn red leather. In its mouth was a forked tongue and fangs. I could see a smile. The thing was laughing. I could hear manic and uncontrollable laughter reverberating all around. I averted my eyes and glanced outside the Silkman suite's window. Where once I'd seen buildings and parks and people, there was now only a hellscape with dark skies, fallen angels, and rivers of lava. I turned on my heels and ran towards the door. I grabbed the handle and twisted it, but the door was locked. I couldn't let go. I couldn't get out of room 7. I kept trying to frantically twist and shake the handle to open the door, but it wouldn't move. I took a deep breath, and I turned to see the creature emerging from the mist, and another one following behind it. The prospect of this sight sparked an almighty shiver that shot right down my spine, which literally tingled with undiluted terror. As I braced myself to turn, a dark curtain fell over my eyes, and all my senses stopped transmitting. My brain went dead. 2 hours and 50 minutes had vanished. That time was stolen from me. I don't know how I escaped the dark embrace of the Silkman suite. I was just glad that I did. My memory was blank. My mouth was bone dry. The priest was long gone, but the Hotel Antelope remained open for business. To my own bewilderment, I was stood at the front desk of main reception. The tips of my fingers had a tingling sensation. I felt cold to the very core. Glancing across and seeing I was in no fit state to work, Greg unceremoniously sent me home sick. But before you go, I need to remind you, only 1 month remains before the relaunch. I need you fresh and on point. I want you and I to touch base and think outside the box, so we can circle back on your core competencies, Greg said as I packed my things. He was becoming fluent in business speak. Cool, was all I could say as I rushed for the exit. Then I turned and asked, "So it's definitely going ahead then? The reopening, I mean. They're really going to refurbish and reopen room 7. Greg cupped his ear as if pretending he couldn't hear my question. He clearly wanted to escape further scrutiny of what we both knew could be a catastrophic corporate disaster by reopening the sinister Silkman suite. Like a portal to hell, room 7 was better off closed. Greg Martino gave me one job that morning. I had only one task, and that task was a man. That man was arriving at the front desk in 1 minute. I'd done all I could to prepare for this moment, 30 years in the making. Today, the first guest would be staying in the freshly refurbished room 7, the Silkman suite of the Hotel Antelope. I focused on the task and compartmentalized any lingering fear. The blue-tinted glass doors parted. An expensive suit with a human male inside strolled into our new gleaming glass and steel reception for me to greet him warmly. Greg observed our every interaction. He was hanging on by a thread with corporate, and this was either the beginning of the end of his stewardship at the Hotel Antelope or the start of a glorious new chapter. But I didn't care at all about that. I just focused on our guest. His name was Mr. Emberton, and he smelt like a barbecue. He had a lazy eye and black painted fingernails. I noticed he was softly spoken and muscularly assembled. Thin, plucked eyebrows curled up at the ends playfully. A series of somewhat strange requests followed our introductions. The requests made were to be followed strictly for the duration of Mr. Emberton's stay in the Silkman suite. Reception was busy that morning. There were various meetings and events occurring at the Hotel Antelope, and the lobby was brimming with an eclectic bunch of businessmen, milling midwives, and attendees of a continental clown convention. Arms dealers were brunching with influencers, and all in our little world seemed well. But my attention remained on Mr. Emberton and his strange and somewhat random requests. He was staying indefinitely on a rolling weekly basis in the Silkman suite. He was paying a beyond premium price for this long-term booking and convenient flexibility. Payment would be made at 6 p.m. on the Friday of each week, via a credit card left on file at the front reception desk. The charge would only be authorised after Mr. Emberton had verbally approved payment prior to the 6 p.m. scheduling. "I only want you," Mr. Emberton said. "Excuse me?" I replied. I looked over at Greg. My manager nodded his approval. "Our most esteemed guest will only make payment to you each Friday at 6 p.m. No one else." Mr. Emberton required no room service. No incoming calls were to be transferred by staff from reception to room 7. "Unless that incoming call is being made by my daughter," Mr. Emberton added. Any post or correspondence of any kind intended for delivery to the recipient in room 7 was to remain unopened and undelivered and to be disposed of immediately. Fresh towels and one bloody and undercooked steak were to be delivered by room service to Mr. Emberton on Monday at 6 a.m. weekly. He would require no further access to hotel services or facilities and would largely like to be left alone in his room. A blast of warm, hazy air emanating from outside washed over the reception desk as the sliding doors to the Hotel Antelope opened and closed operatically, as an assortment of guests filtered in jovially. I inputted Mr. Emberton's series of strange and random requests into the system and glanced up to give him the keycard to room 7. He grabbed it from my hand, and before I had the opportunity to bid him goodbye, Mr. Emberton was already gone. The relaunch was a success, and Greg had now respectfully become Mr. Martino. The days turned into weeks. The fresh towels and bloody steaks were delivered outside room 7 every Monday, and each Friday, Mr. Emberton would call me at reception at exactly 6 p.m. to authorise payment. The Silkman suite wasn't cheap, and Mr. Emberton's indefinite stay reaped significant financial rewards for the Hotel Antelope. I almost felt stupid about having all of those safety concerns. History wasn't quite forgotten, but it certainly faded as the weeks turned to months, and our elusive guest continued his stay. All was well. That is, until it wasn't. The two thoughts occurred almost simultaneously. The anniversary of the intrigue in room 7 was fast approaching, and Mr. Emberton hadn't called to pay. We'd received no complaints about his behaviour, and there were no bad smells coming from the room. Our weekly call had provided proof of life, and the weekly profit had ameliorated our concerns about the strangeness of the setup. I'd grown comfortable and accustomed to the routine, so when his call didn't come, I felt anxious and unnerved. I tried calling room 7, but there was no answer. I tried calling again and again, and after the 4th time of my call going unanswered, I accepted the inevitable. I had to journey to the top floor, to room 7, to the Silkman suite, to see Mr. Emberton. I reached the top floor and stood at the far end of the long corridor leading to the room. There was a near perfect silence as I approached his door, but as I arrived immediately outside, I could hear faint music emanating from inside the room. It was a classic power ballad, delivered by a songstress and diva from the 1980s. The song was unmistakable. I would recognise it anywhere. It was the song I wanted to be played at my funeral. Immediately after the lung-blasting crescendo, I waited for the decibels to lower, and then I knocked politely on the door. Instantly, all sounds stopped. There was no more music. The songstress had warbled her way into oblivion, and I worried that I may soon be joining her there. "Mr. Emberton?" I inquired, half hoping for no response. A little louder this time. "Sir?" I knocked again and then started to walk away. I heard shuffling inside the suite and what sounded like giggling. I glanced at the door again, and then I saw something emerging that had me rub my eyes in disbelief. Between the gap of the closed door and the carpeted floor, a mist was again emerging. Slowly at first, and then it started flowing freely and forming in the corridor into something demonic and ungodly, with monkey limbs and a horse's head. I pulled away, startled, and ran to the elevator. The doors couldn't shut soon enough. I heard someone calling my name. I frantically searched for the elevator controls, but the buttons didn't have numbers or up or down choices. They just said truth and lie. Before I had the chance to choose, the elevator door started closing. But just before the two doors touched, a hoof-like hand shot in between them and became trapped. I lifted my leg and kicked the hoof with all of my force, and it became unstuck. I heard the creature screech and scream, but I couldn't tell if it was from pleasure or pain. The door closed and the elevator descended. Then it kept descending. It wouldn't stop going down. I pressed the buttons frantically. Then I noticed my ankles were wet. The elevator was filling with water. It was up to my knees now. Still further it rose, until the warm water reached my neck, then my mouth. And soon I could feel the wet liquid invading my lungs. And that's when I lost consciousness. The curtains were closed to the world outside my apartment window. Several days had passed since the descent. Yet, I'd relived each moment every night since. I'd had surprisingly few phone calls since I stopped turning up for work. My mind was numb, and my body borderline malnourished. I hadn't eaten in days. The air in my apartment was heavy and still. Out of the silence, the phone call came. I could hear fumbling at the other end of the line, and then a familiar voice spoke. "It's Greg Martino here, manager of the Hotel Antelope." "I know who you are, Greg. We've worked together for 20 years, I replied. Greg informed me bluntly that Mr. Emberton was dead, and the cops had some questions for me. The computer confirmed my keycard had been used to access the Silkman suite. CCTV showed me entering room 7. "I don't remember any of this. I never went inside, that's impossible," I said, eyes closed, almost whimpering. "But the strange thing is they don't show you leaving," responded Greg. "I have someone with me, a detective. We're right outside your apartment and we need to speak to you. Now." I opened the door to my apartment, and Greg greeted me with fearful eyes and an artificial smile. The detective stood next to him. It was a short female officer with closely cropped hair and narrow eyes that scrutinized me suspiciously. She was older than I expected, probably pushing retirement. She looked tough, but also somewhat motherly in her mannerisms. We gathered in my living room, and I offered them coffee. There were no clean cups, so I stepped into the kitchen to wash a few. The detective followed me through. "What happened in room 7, son?" the detective asked solemnly. I turned the tap on the sink, and the water came flowing. "He drowned, didn't he, Mr. Emberton?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He did drown. But something else happened also. So I need to ask you again, and I need you to tell me the truth. What happened in the Silkman suite?" The detective placed her hand comfortingly on my shoulder. There was a long, vacant pause before I replied with the only words I could manage. "What happened, you ask? very bad things.